glad that you agreed to do this. Like, I mean, you've been on some big shows, the Huberman podcast and Lex Friedman, and it's pretty
Yeah,
cool.
those are the biggies.
Yeah. So, psychedelics, this is such a fascinating topic. It's really gotten a lot more exposure lately, like a lot more articles and research has been done. And you're kind of on the front lines of this, right?
Yeah, I've been in the psychedelic area for 20 years. Long before it became popular in the last, really, it's really hit hard in the last 5 years. So kind of seen that trajectory where, it was kind of called a career killer and what in the world is this? Oh, good luck. Now we have, multi-billion dollar industry and, that's focused on potential FDA approval. And it's kind of easier to name the number of top medical institutions that don't have a psychedelic program. It's easier to do that than name the ones that do, so it's really just dramatically, shifted.
Wow, that's interesting. So, how did you get interested in the topic 20 years ago? I mean, yeah, like you said, that people would have thought you were crazy to go into that. So, what made you decide to tackle that?
Well, I became familiar with the older work from a lot of times we say the 60s, but it's really the 1950s to the early 1970s, primarily with LSD. But I discovered in college that through looking through that history, and this is sort of pre-internet, era, so at the library reading, old accounts and, books and looking through microfiche, if people remember what that was, and, finding the resources, discovering that it's not like, research really looked into it and the therapeutic work found that it squarely didn't work. It was really just and this was argued with LSD, looking to treat alcoholism and end of life cancer, distress, other things. But it was more that it was a political casualty. Psychedelics, particularly LSD, became very popular in the late 60s, and were very popular for a while until the mid 70s. And they've always been around, they've never gone away. But in that initial, what we think of as the 60s, really kind of starting in the mid late 60s, with the popularity of psychedelics, mainly LSD, that really was why the therapeutic work came to an end. And psychedelics being associated with all kinds of countercultural changes in society and so much that the medical research, the scientific work in general was a casualty. And I was someone with an early interest in behavioral science, psychology, um, understanding behavior change. How can we help people to achieve behavior change, to kind of fulfill themselves? And so I had kind of roots in behavioral psychology and also this growing interest in psychopharmacology, how drugs in general work, everything from caffeine to alcohol to cocaine to, psychedelics. And amongst those, different substances, I mean, they're all fascinating in the sense like, how can you have these little molecules that have such profound effects, good and bad, on, interacting with the brain and causing changes the way people behave and think. Um, and I think the psychedelics are just the most interesting example of that because they're just examples of people saying they took a psychedelic one time, sometimes decades ago, and they could say, oh, it changed my life in this direction. You just don't hear any reports like that with other drugs, like even with cannabis. Obviously lots of therapeutic effects and lots of, there's a reality there, but I've never heard a single person say, oh, they smoked pot one time, 20 years ago, never touched it since, but they smoked pot one time and they had this, you know, radical alteration that set their life on this more positive path. That's certainly not the normative or typical psychedelic use, but it's also not uncommon to come across people with those claims. I mean, be they
Hmm.
scientists or people in the tech industry and, artists. I mean, just countless musicians, have made claims like that. So it seemed like there was probably something there, that had just been kind of ignored. And I also think, there's a reason that the CIA was looking into this stuff for many years. as brain on the dark side of, mind manipulation and brainwashing and behavior change,
Yeah, how
and
does that work? Because MK Ultra, there was all these secret government programs, and I think MK Ultra was one of them. And they were, I mean, they were, what was it, like dosing people and then getting to have sex with prostitutes or something. So how does using that as a mind manipulation, if it's more of a insightful, you have these eye-opening experiences, how do you use it as an evil, dark way to manipulate people?
well, I think it's consistent with everything we've learned, and my best formulation of how these work is, they don't fundamentally push one in any of these directions. They don't, inherently, give people sort of, kumbaya, all is one, this kind of transcendent vision, nor do they make people maniacal, cult followers, but they can do all of the above under the right
Hmm.
conditions.
Hmm.
So it's more of like, it's like, if an artist puts um, they make a mold, like it's like a plastic, when you turn up the heat, now it's more pliable. It's like this temporary state that makes things more pliable, and depending on the hands of the artist and the conditions, he could do good things with that or bad things with that. So
Hmm.
it's a radically altered acute state that has potentially such power to alter the person afterwards in good or bad ways, and so that accounts for both the um, positive effects, as well as the anecdotes, not just of brainwashing and mind control and Charles Manson, and there's a reality there, MK Ultra, but even just delusional experiences. It does appear that psychedelics can make people worse who have psychotic disorders like schizophrenia. I mean, if you're already kind of if you're if you're holding on to consensus reality by a thread, probably the last thing you need is a high dose of a psychedelic, which can at least temporarily really kind of disconnect one from consensus reality. And so there can be some long-term destabilization of people with disorders like schizophrenia. And
Hmm.
so that kind of like that general pliability model is applicable to all of that, the good, the bad, the ugly. I mean, it's been called, a non-specific amplifier, for example, which is consistent with that. It's another way of saying the same thing.
Hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, just disclaimer here, we don't condone the use of psychedelics. I'm only, you're doing this under the supervision of in a therapeutic setting.
Right.
So explain how
All
you,
the approvals, DEA,
yeah.
FDA, institutional reviews, legal at the state, federal, and yeah, every level.
Yeah. So what if someone comes into your clinic and they want to have this experience, what does the therapeutic setting look like? Like, is there psychedelic posters and things, or is it very clinical, just like white walls, or what does it look like?
Something in between that.
Okay.
So first thing to keep in mind is that it's not like the days of the early days of LSD research in the 60s where Sandoz Pharmaceuticals will just send anybody, any, doctor a vial of LSD and you can try it on your patients. And these have to be highly regulated and approved research studies. So for example, right now I'm doing research on using psilocybin, which is the agent in magic mushrooms, to treat tobacco addiction. And that's a line of research I've had for over 15 years. It looks very promising. So for that, one signs up for this trial. They decide whether they want to be in this study, like a current study. It's comparing psilocybin to a placebo in the context of cognitive behavioral therapy, a talk therapy to help people overcome their smoking addiction. And we're screening, not everyone qualifies, and there's informed consent, and if someone's passes screening and they sign up, then there's a lot. The sessions
Yeah.
themselves are, they're not, it's not take two and call me in the morning. It's done in
Okay.
a clinic with people that they've developed a rapport with, that they trust.
So
So
how are the results of that compared to like Chantix? Or so, because that drug kind of is that the one that could cause suicidal ideation, or I mean, there seems like some very
Yeah,
serious
there
side
was
effects
black
with that.
box warnings surrounding that, and so far, and it's always, we haven't, for example, there done a head-to-head comparison
Hmm.
with Chantix. So you got, as a scientist, I always want to have the caveat is, okay, can't speak super conclusively until you have that like randomized head-to-head comparison. But I've recently wrapped up a head-to-head comparison to nicotine patch,
Oh,
which is sort of in typically Chantix works a little better, although I would argue the side effects more serious, as you alluded to.
the risk, yeah. I mean, of
In the same
suicide.
ballpark of efficacy in terms of
Okay.
it works, something in between, typically between 20-30% for both. And so recently did a head-to-head comparison and more than doubled the success rates of nicotine patch. So
Wow.
it's looking very, and that's long term. That's at 6 months, with most people being quit 6 months later. Which the typical study is that the large majority of people are still smoking, and even a successful treatment, you're
Hmm.
talking a favorable outcome is typically 20% in the treatment group is smoke free, and 10% in the control condition is smoke free. So yeah, that's an effective treatment. It's doing better
Okay.
than
Yeah.
placebo. But the
Statistically
biggest story is
significant.
that 80-90% of people are still smoking. So there's
Wow.
more room for improvement. So it doesn't, and nothing's gonna work for everyone, to be clear. So I always want to remind people of that. This isn't, not everyone's going to be interested in this. Not everyone's going to qualify. I do think it's a fundamentally different treatment paradigm that could help a lot of people that haven't been helped so far.
Hmm.
And the way it works is fundamentally differently. I think it has far more to do with psychology. It's this temporary radical alteration of brain function, which the mind is very different during the experience, the trip. But then the interesting thing is that can be such a profound experience that it can have lasting impacts on the way the person thinks and behaves afterwards. So when it works, it looks like good psychotherapy more than it looks like your typical psychiatric drug, which is treating symptoms.
Hmm.
You
So as
know,
part of the treatment, like you give them psilocybin, and then do you like you say certain things to them while they're on the psilocybin, like you don't need cigarettes. This is, or is that part of the, or do you just give them the psilocybin and then let them kind of have their own journey?
it's sort of the latter. Yeah, yeah. So we haven't
Okay.
done the Clockwork Orange, sort of programming during. If it's done ethically, I'm all for that. Research. I'd like to see the results. Want to make sure they consent to what those messages are.
Sure. Yeah. Well, yeah.
But the
Yeah.
model so far, and this dates back to the work that was done, and really dating back to the late 1950s, where it was these researchers in Saskatchewan, Canada, that first came up with this psychedelic therapy model. I mean, LSD had been used in different ways before there, but this particular way of using it was developed in the late 50s by those folks. And we're doing, the same type of stuff with psilocybin, which is in the same category as LSD in terms of the way it works in the brain. But it's, you prepare somebody. So if you give it to someone who's not prepared and they're with people that they don't know well, they're with strangers, a lot of times it looks more like a psychotic experience temporarily.
Hmm.
Some of the very earliest research was done in a white padded room, and without really any preparation. And what you get under those conditions is, people look temporarily crazy, like you're mimicking psychosis. But under conditions where they're prepared for things like, yeah, like can be an overwhelming experience. You could feel like you're going to die. Physiologically, it's very safe, and we've screened you for the few things that we think could be dangerous, like if you're at severe risk of heart disease, simply because it raises your blood pressure, typically modestly. But we think it's a very, aside from you being screened, we're also monitoring it. So there's a physician on hand who could administer rescue medication. So we're gonna keep you safe physically, but we let them know, like, yeah, you could feel like you're dying. I could feel like you could have, your mind could go anywhere, good, bad, ugly. So you prepare them for that, and you develop a trust and rapport with. You have something. It's ranged typically from 4 to 8 hours, and meeting time with those people. Sometimes they're called guides or the therapist, the people that will be there during the session with you. So you're not going into, and the idea is like with strangers, you could delve into paranoia. It's more likely to have a paranoid reaction. And you see that sometimes people take some shrooms or acid at a concert, and yeah, they're surrounded by mostly strangers, and sometimes people do freak out. They're like, who is that person? You know, what were they? And in fact, you can't trust everyone. You should make sure your wallet and your purse and I mean, you know, like people are sometimes sexually assaulted and their wallet stolen, and you know, bad things can happen. So, you know, one is very vulnerable when they're in this state. So it's really, really important to have someone ideally with in a situation where they completely trust what's happening. They know they're being kept safe. They're not going to be left alone.
So do
And
they
so
typically bring in a spouse or a girlfriend or boyfriend or something like that?
no, although that could be looked at in future research, and then you'd want to train that person about how to respond. So it complexifies things, but typically that person will sometimes be brought in at the end of the session,
Hmm.
once the effects have worn off, and so kind of handing off to a loved one for them to like drive them home or be with them that evening, and be with them at home and feel like they're a part of the process. But yeah, it's typically with a therapist that's developed this rapport, and during the experience, there's not like talk, programmed experiences where you're giving them messages. It's just wear these eye shades. We're gonna the music is programmed, but it's very general. It's different studies have done different things, but
Wait, what kind of music are we listening to?
typically classical music, but different things have
Okay.
been done. Sometimes I've done music with like lots of gongs and
Hmm.
drones and sort of this sort of overtone based, didgeridoo and kind of out there things. I did a little work comparing that to classical music. Found they basically performed about the same. So I think lots of music could be brought to bear to it, but the idea is the music provides some psychological structure, and it can kind of obviously music by itself can be inspirational and can work with emotion and heighten emotion, and so that's the reason to have for the music. But the typical model has been wearing earphones through which that music is played. They're not sort of playing DJ and saying, "Oh, now play this and play that." It's pre-selected 6 hours worth of music, and then the therapist is really there for as a safety net. If all goes well, there's hardly anything said.
Hmm.
But if the person says, "Oh man, I'm starting to freak out. I didn't know it'd feel like this." It's like I don't. Oh, this I'm not feeling right. It's
What do
like
you do? Yeah, at that point.
well, interpersonal reassurance, and that's where the rapport comes in handy. You remind them and say, "Hey, it's Matt. I'm here. I'm not leaving you alone." It's really powerful to like just take their hand, and you prepare them for that, and they consent to that. But that also addresses an issue like there have been sexual abuses in the field, and I think it's important to just leave it at the hand. So like, you're not feeling all over doing body work, which some of this hippie stuff where it's like yeah, man, you're gonna have some creeps involved that are gonna take advantage of that, and like so, like make it very clear it's just gonna be your hand, or I've done like with the hand or the shoulder, but that can be very powerful. Just say I'm with you, I'm not leaving you, you're okay.
Hmm.
We're not leaving you alone. That's where it can be useful to have two people, because even if 6 hour experience, someone's gonna need to go to the bathroom at some
Sure.
point, but so that other person is in the room. And there's also models where probably more realistic in terms of clinical dissemination where you have one person in the room, but during those times when they have to leave, they can call in someone, modern technologies, send them a text or whatever. It's like, oh, I need you to come in the room, push a button, whatever. They can come in, pinch hit for you. They've also have some rapport with the person. So, then you could go, whatever, urinate, do whatever you need to do, 5 minutes, come back
Yeah.
and be with them. So you don't leave the person alone. They're always with someone they trust in
Yeah.
case you have a site. And you have a physician on hand. They don't have to be in the room, but they might be in the building, whatever. So you're occasionally monitoring blood pressure at a set time intervals in case the blood pressure gets too high, which rarely, but sometimes happens. And they can always come and administer a medication that can bring that down some. And in worst case scenario, it's had to be done sometimes, but not typical, but if anxiety becomes overwhelming, they could be given, something like a Xanax type drug, a
Oh.
benzodiazepine to take the edge off.
Yeah, because I know some people, and you talk about having an intention and then making sure they're in the right place to do this. But some people, I feel like myself, I feel like I'm just this kind of shit always like it gives me anxiety. I think like some people love roller coasters and some people hate them.
Right.
And I think it's the same with psychedelics. Some people love it and they can't. I just remember my friends in high school, they were doing acid like every day. And I was like, well, how do you guys go through school just like a regular school day on acid? Like that is insane to me. I could take a little bit of,
Yeah.
zero point 0.5 milligram of weed and I'm like, oh my God, I'm freaking out. The world is going, like, so
Right.
there's
Right.
different personalities, right? So how do
Yeah.
you kind of screen that beforehand?
Well, part of that's that level of screening where it's frankly more self-selection. Like someone
Mm.
who, would never want to do it is probably never going to call up for that study, because this isn't obviously picking people off the street. I
Well,
mean,
yeah, but it's like, see, because there's a part of me that's like, oh my God, I hate psychedelics, so scary. But then when you talk about the benefits and these breakthroughs, then I'm kind of go, well, maybe I need to just push through it and try it.
right. And that's where, you really have to prepare the person when they come in. And at the consent process, you do warn them. It's like, hey, like a lot of people get the impression, oh, like this is medical research, so you guys are probably using a pretty light dose. And actually, no, this is
Use
this
a
is actually
heroic
a bigger
dose, I
dose
heard.
than is even typically taken in a recreational context.
Yeah,
And the
you can
reason
say
why
30
is
to 40
because
milligrams of psilocybin. That's
yeah,
a
30,
lot,
40
right?
milligrams of psilocybin, which is equivalent to the classic. I don't know if you're familiar with the heroic dose of 5 dried grams of psilocybe cubensis mushrooms, which Terence McKenna, who was sort of a psychedelic philosopher of sorts, used to kind of recommend. Like that's the real deal, like the heroic dose. And
Hmm.
so it's bigger than what most people like. If people are familiar with mushroom dosing, someone might buy an eighth ounce of dried mushrooms, split it 2 or 3 ways. It's not a microdose, like they're gonna have a real experience, but it's gonna be moderate. The, 5 dried grams, or the equivalent of about 30 milligrams of pure psilocybin, is somewhere in between an eighth ounce and quarter ounce of mushroom. So it's not splitting that eighth ounce 2 or 3 ways. It's actually taking more than an eighth ounce, like for one person. So
Hmm.
it's a pretty high dose I mean, most people don't want to take this dose at a concert. And to be clear, like
Right.
I'm not recommending any of the above, but I'm just describing, for people who have used these things, some reference point. Not recommending people do these things on their own or outside of a legal
Yeah.
context.
Well,
But
besides,
it's a high dose.
yeah. So besides like the psychological component, explain the like physiological component in the brain or how because I know so here's what happened. Actually, like how a part of the reason I got interested in this topic is my dad fell off a ladder and he had a head
Uh,
injury and he was given some sort of prescription drug and it was causing him all these side effects. He could barely walk. And then he started doing his own research, which I know you're not supposed to do, but he said that he was reading up about these NHL players. And I found an article too. And the NHL players are using psilocybin with head injuries. So he started microdosing mushrooms, which, if you know
right.
my dad, this is like crazy. This guy is I grew up in a very conservative household. We're, very anti-drug. And he swears by it. He said it changed the doctors were baffled when they looked at his brain scan. There was
Interesting.
no evidence of the concussion a year later, and they said he was at risk if he didn't take this anti-seizure medication. He was going to have a seizure, and never had any issue. Now it's been like I think it's been like 2 years, and he's totally fine. So what is going
That's
on there? How does
fascinating.
psilocybin help head injuries?
So, and we don't know for sure because these are anecdotes, but that it could very well be real, and I take it very seriously. And again, like you, I'm not encouraging people to do this, but I do survey work and I talk to plenty of people, and I keep my ears open for what those anecdotes are. And Dan Carcillo, he reached out years ago. He's was notable NHL player, retired now, but had through both neurological issues and psychiatric depression and substance use issues, like just said psychedelics changed everything for him. And there's a number of those examples across a number of sports. And so we do know that in rats that psychedelics, including psilocybin, lead to different forms of neuroplasticity. We don't know yet for sure whether that's happening in humans, but it's a very good bet. I mean, you kind of have to cut open people's, animals' brains to see if, to
Oh,
really direct. So, we tend to not want to do that to people, but you can do it to rats.
sure.
So that's why we don't have direct evidence, but it's a very good bet that that's part of what it's doing in people. What we do know is that it's activating a subtype of serotonin receptor, serotonin 2A. That has downstream effects on other neurotransmitters like glutamate. We know that at the broader level of like what's called brain network activity, the communication patterns across the brain, what that receptor level activation leads to is this massive change in the network activity, the communication patterns of the brain, where there's more crosstalk between areas that don't normally talk as much. And in other instances, there's less communication amongst hubs or local networks that do talk to each other. I kind of liken that to the internet coming into society where, beforehand, maybe you had, you're going to talk more to the people, your neighbors, people you're part of town. And now it's like, for better or worse, you might not know your neighbors, but you play chess with some kid in Pakistan because you're both into chess, so it's like
Right.
just like scrambling of the normal communication
Huh.
patterns, and that can again come with good stuff and bad stuff.
Okay.
Try to cross the street on a high dose of psychedelic. The other
So,
thing with your dad's anecdote is that he sounds like he's talking about microdosing, which hasn't been looked at much in research. There may very well be, it's not the heroic dose model, the high dose.
well, he said it was microdosing. Then he said he is supposed to, it says on he got these chocolate bars, I guess, and it said
Yeah,
take 1 or 2 squares. He said he ate the whole thing, which, like, when I talk to
not a
people, they go, that's
microdose.
crazy. Like, and my dad said, I don't know. I felt fine. I didn't have any sort of, he's like, all he said is he felt a lot of gratitude. He said he always feels gratitude, but when he took, the bigger dose of psilocybin, he said he just, that feeling of gratitude just amplified, basically.
Right. Yeah, that sounds like a little more than a microdose, and that's one of the issues with microdosing is, and for those that aren't aware, microdose is supposed to be so low of a level that you could go about your daily business. In fact, people
Right.
that do microdosing say, take it a couple of times a week, and you're doing the normal things. Like part of the issue is like, yeah, you might think it's a microdose, and then the walls start waving, and you're like, okay, and then it's a problem if people are out there driving and they're taking care of little kids, and obviously all kinds of things, making the important decisions at work. But we don't know for sure whether the microdosing is really having the therapeutic effects. I'd say that there's a very good chance that a subset of these claims are something very real. But it's just that the appropriate studies haven't been done yet. There's been a few studies. The best kind of studies, they haven't so far. They haven't validated some of the psychiatric effects that have been claimed that it's like more like an ADHD treatment, and um, it there's so many caveats because these haven't been done in clinical like populations that have disorders to treat. Plus, there's a myriad of different things being treated. Like you're talking about concussion, which is a neurological disorder, which may be fundamentally different than improving your depression or your
Hmm.
anxiety, which is what we call psychiatric
What
affective
about
anxiety issue.
with PTSD? There is research on that. And that would make sense given what you're talking about, how the brain is able to talk to other parts,
Yeah,
because I think, isn't
and
it
they
typical
get
with
stuck. Yeah,
PTSD, they're blocking out that trauma. And
right.
then when they take the psilocybin, then they're allowed to access it and process it better. Is that what's going on?
Yeah, that's a good description. Now, the most advanced kind of clinical work has been done with MDMA, which is a different type of a psychedelic, sometimes
Hmm.
known as on the street as Molly or ecstasy. Psilocybin is the compound in mushrooms, which is sort of it's called a classic psychedelic. So
Right.
MDMA, some scientists don't consider it a real psychedelic. Some people call it a psychedelic, some people don't. Ultimately that's just semantics. It's similar, but works in somewhat of a different way. It's releases serotonin in the brain rather than kind of mimicking activating the same receptor that serotonin normally activates in the brain, like a classic psychedelic does. But nonetheless, very psychedelic like. People, in terms of effects, people will describe it as more of a kind of an emotional trip rather than a, reality is unzipping. And so it's not like the full trip, less potential for, it would seem, for a so-called bad trip, more of an emotional experience rather than having these, more fundamental kind of changes in, one's perception of reality. But that was unfortunately rejected by the FDA pretty recently for the treatment of PTSD. And a lot of hopes were up that it would be approved. I think it's very likely that it will be approved eventually, but FDA is requiring more work. And it's probably more related to the way the sponsor had conducted some of the trials rather than just a sort of a block, just the idea that, the government is so opposed that they're never going to accept this. It came down to some nuanced issues, and there were some issues that clouded the case. Like there were some cases, like there was a case of sexual abuse where a therapist started sleeping with the patient, after the formal treatment was over, and it, and these are real risks actually, because people can say this is like one of the most meaningful experiences of their life, and they're in these very vulnerable psychological states, and that can, people can fall into this trap of, thinking that the normal rules don't apply because you're connecting with this person at this fundamental level. I'd say that's all the more reason to cling to these traditional boundaries of like, don't sleep with your patients, don't keep any potential romantic, you keep all that stuff in check. You're an adult. There are real consequences to things. And, that stuff goes on too much in therapy in general, forget psychedelics, but I would say it's amplified with psychedelics. So that clouded the case somewhat. And there were also some questions about the nature of the psychotherapy that they had used, and some issue about, well, was this driven all by placebo? People's high expectations and the fact that you can tell whether you're on the drug or a placebo, a sugar pill or not. I think these are surmountable obstacles, but I think a lot of the other sponsors that are going forward with that, with psychedelic treatments to the FDA, they're going to come in much better positioned. And this sponsor itself, Lycos is the name. I think they're going to, come back with doing additional research and very likely get approval, but it's been somewhat of a setback.
Okay.
I think over time we're going to see psychedelics approved by the FDA.
Yeah. What about with ketamine? Because I mean, obviously people know the case of Matthew Perry was taking ketamine to take home, which I don't think you're supposed to do that. I think you're supposed to do it in a supervised environment, but it can be powerful and insightful to some people. And I guess in Russia, they used high doses of ketamine to work with heroin and alcohol addiction. They had great results.
So Krupitsky's old work. Yeah, that's great that you're familiar with that. Unfortunately, that was mainly in the 90s, or I think maybe those publications, some of them were still coming out in the early 2000s. They had to stop that work when Russia rescheduled ketamine as essentially what we would call a Schedule 1 drug, put it in that category where it was virtually impossible to do any medical work with it, even research. And so, but that did look very promising. Now, ketamine was approved, and a version of ketamine called S-ketamine was approved, oh gosh, what are we coming up on, 8 or more years ago now, was approved for the treatment of depression. It might have been more recent than that, but over 5 years ago, it was approved, called Spravato, the brand name. It's a nasal spray, which has one of the one version of ketamine. One of the issues is you don't have intellectual property on ketamine, what's called racemic ketamine. And so the company, Johnson & Johnson, the pharmaceutical company Janssen, which is part of Johnson & Johnson, had this, the intellectual property on this one version of ketamine. So anyway, like, you get into this realm with pharmaceuticals where a lot of it's about proprietary intellectual property, but they approved this, nasal spray. Now, ketamine is very psychedelic. You get it, but it's like this. It's like what I said about MDMA. Some scientists will say this doesn't even count as a psychedelic. Well, it's at least a relative. It's very at high doses. It's very psychedelic-like, at least, and it works as in a different pathway through the glutamate system. As I said before, the classic psychedelics like psilocybin initially activate an aspect of the serotonin system, but there's downstream effects, like one of the further dominoes that fall in the chain of the cascade of brain changes is on the glutamate system. So it may be that the glutamate system is a common pathway for some of these different classes of so-called psychedelics. But ketamine was approved for the treatment of depression. One of the issues is that it's not treated really as a psychedelic at the time during the approval. That's back when psychedelic therapy wasn't as popular as it was now. So they really try to distance themselves. And the framing isn't that, oh, you're going to have these different insights. You're going to learn from this. The framing was, no, it just does some stuff in your brain. Ignore, you're going to feel weird, but ignore that. And it's just going to have this automatic effect, more analogous to a traditional psychiatric medication. And it does appear to have some effect in using it like that. It's a pretty modest dose. It's not typically an overwhelming psychological dose. But I would argue if they treated it more like a what we call psychedelic therapy, where the point is to gain insights and learn from this altered state of awareness, I would say there's a decent chance the effects would be longer lasting, that would last on average more than a week, which is how long the antidepressant effects last for ketamine, for S-ketamine Spravato. Now, because ketamine has been approved for decades as an anesthetic, non-proprietary ketamine, which is pretty cheap medically because it's used in anesthesia and other surgeries, et cetera, that there's lots of physicians that are giving. In fact, most of the ketamine treatment for depression is done not with Spravato, but with generic ketamine. And that can be done through intramuscular injections, or they could formulate their own nasal spray, or sometimes it's given in lozenges, different formulations, but sometimes that is sent home with people legally. So there's a lot of discretion with that. And because it's done off label, it's up to the physician, and there's companies even built upon sending patients home with ketamine lozenges and other forms of ketamine.
So is that common then? Because I think that the family of Matthew Perry is suing the doctor like he wasn't supposed to do that.
Yeah. So you get in a lot of these situations where there's not exactly a rule against it. But it's sort of like the use of opioid analgesics. If you're a physician and you're writing thousands of scripts, man, you don't be surprised if you get some attention from the DEA and the FDA. And so you might be pushing the bounds of what's considered, and your state, so the practice of medicine is regulated by the state, not at the federal level. So don't be surprised if people want to pull your state medical license up for, call it into question and bring you up on charges. So there is kind of a gray area, even if it's technically legal or there's not an explicit rule against it. It is in the zone where, some people would call it malpractice and dangerous. I would certainly say it's not a good idea to be doing self-treatment ketamine at home if it's prescribed by one of and some of these companies are. It's sort of like, you can get ADHD drugs like this or TRT, testosterone replacement like this, where, you with the right money, you got the credit card, you can call up, you can have a 5-minute Zoom call with a physician who will make the prescription. And I'm wondering about what percentage of people are denied, as long as their credit card goes through, and you'll get the script and it was prescribed by a physician and they'll mail it to you and you get your TRT or whatever. And Viagra is probably the biggest example of this. You can get erectile dysfunction drugs like this, and whether it's that or testosterone or ADHD meds. There's a lot of these companies that focus on this kind of quick, especially with telemedicine.
Gotcha.
and then sending it home. And so if I was those companies, I would be worried because of the case of Matthew Perry. And I think a lot of people should pay attention. I think there's a lot of open questions. Like apparently he was getting it from, both from my understanding, only from what I've read. I don't have any inside information, but from what I've read in the press, from both, prescriptions from doctors as well as, the traditional, whatever, recreational ways of whatever, scoring it from, people in the illicit market or divert it from medical use. And yeah, there are definitely risks to ketamine, like there are with all substances. And he, passed out. I mean, you could lose consciousness, and yeah, that doesn't mix well with water.
Right.
I don't mean to make light of it at all. I mean, he drowned when he was just, and that's actually a thing with ketamine. There are some notable cases in the history of people that are really into the psychedelic recreational use of ketamine that have even drowned in their bathtub. It's kind of been a thing
Wow.
where apparently the effects, it's sort of like if you know of float tanks,
Hmm.
where people, people have combined ketamine with even which is like floating in their own bathtub
Okay.
at home, where apparently that, can magnify this kind of out of body sensation. So like people have drowned in like, 10 inches of water.
Wow.
The same way if you're drunk, like, yeah, like don't, it's like people say turn the person on their side because like if they vomit, they could choke on their own vomit. Like,
Gotcha.
when you're super intoxicated, like bad stuff can happen, man.
Yeah. Well, besides so the ketamine was looked at with addiction. What other psychedelics can be used to help people with addiction? And could people use that process now? Because I know there's a lot of people who have been through rehab a bunch. That didn't work. They've tried counseling. They've tried all these other things, and they're kind of at the end of their rope. So if for those kinds of people who want to try something else and want to try a different thing, what can they do to deal with addiction in terms of using psychedelics?
So psilocybin looks promising for addiction. So not I mentioned the tobacco addiction work, which is interesting because it's, tobacco is different. That, it's typically like, your life hasn't crumbled, your wife hasn't left you, you haven't ruined your career and wasted your life fortune. It's like, but it's a very real addiction. Talk to anyone who's really tried to quit
Yeah.
smoking, and some people will say it's just as bad, if not worse, than the biggies, than opioids and cocaine, or it's right
Well,
up there.
and didn't you do an
But
episode about food addiction and psilocybin?
yeah, I think there's incredible promise there because, and that's kind of gets to the point about tobacco and alcohol and coke. I've got a good colleague that's doing some work with cocaine. The the reason that it seems to be working across these different forms of addiction, which is different than most addiction medications, which are typically substitute treatments. They work at the surface level, like methadone or Suboxone for opioid addiction. It kind of quells your craving for the drug, but in a more sustainable, less yo-yo fashion. Very similar to nicotine gum or nicotine patch or nicotine lozenge. And frankly, even though it's not technically considered medication, it's like, taking Zyn pouches or even e-cigarettes. It's a safer form of getting the same substance in. But this is fundamentally different because it's working across these different addictive drugs. And I would say because it hits that psychology that ties them across. So it's not about the surface level like withdrawal and quelling the physiological cravings for these substances. It more gets at what I think is the bigger aspect. It's like addictions, the threads of addiction are more like that iceberg with like, the part you see poking above, that might be the withdrawal, surface level effects of like tobacco or alcohol or coke, most of it is like this underneath the water. It's that, and it's more in the realm of psychotherapy and more kind of philosophical and about like, what's the narrative of my life? How much attention am I devoting to this thing versus, my family and these principles that I hold in life about being healthy, and I want my kids to be healthy and I want the people around me. It's like, so many people in my smoking work, it said like, man, this is crazy. It's like I exercise and I buy freaking organic food because I think it's healthier, but why the world can't I do this? Like I'm still smoking this crap. It's like it's inconsistent with who they are. It's like, And you might think like smoking's even a little different than the others because again, you don't have that degree of life destruction, but it can be in a way very palatable. It's like, this is not who I am. I hate this aspect about me because it just, all of this, it causes all of these harms. And the harms of the different drugs, they're differ, like, yeah, with alcohol, it's going to be very different than smoking, but they all have their categories of harms. And this inability to say, I know this is not ultimately who I am or what I want from life. If you ask me 20 years from now, what did am I going to be proud that I just kept, I always told myself 1,000 times, I got to stop this and I never could. It's like, that's not who I am. It's like, and so it's that kind of, you could call that spiritual, although it doesn't necessarily need to come with, it can come with or without religious or supernatural, a
So
threat.
that's a very common message, that it's like people could say that, but they don't really believe it. When they take the psychedelics, then they're able to kind of step outside of themselves and look, and
Right.
then they actually believe it.
Right. And it's not like, and this gets very philosophical, but it's not like, well, that's like this artificial state. Yes, it's an augmented state that's, caused by the substance in the system. But I think the reason why it tends to stick, not always, but when it does work, why it works well is that people don't feel it was this artificial thing. They felt like the insights, that different perspective of themselves, there was a truth to that, such to the degree when they're, the next day when they wake up and the drug's totally out of their system, and a week from then and a month from then, it's just as valid. And like, once you look, you can't look back. And I think of like with PTSD, it's a good example. It's like people said, it's like, they could look at themselves the way they would look at a loved one or even a perfect stranger, who went through this thing, like, they accidentally shot a kid when they were in Iraq, and it's like they just, split second decision, and they feel like this monster, and it's like, anyone else around them would be like, dude, like, you were in this impossible situation. It's like, you're not inherently like a monster. It's like, look at your resilience. You've done the best that you could. Or, a victim of rape or something, it's like, no, you didn't ask for that. That's crazy. Like, no, this was not you. And look at how resilient you have been. And look at, the way, again, you'd oftentimes afford a stranger more empathy and more understanding and more valid, just ground truth, insight and truth.
Yeah,
Like,
that makes sense. Almost
it's
like
not
common
your
sense
fault.
in a
You're
way.
not inherently just broken,
Right.
and someone can have that insight about themselves, like,
Yeah.
and it's not just like this artificial drug high, even though it comes in the context of a drug high. But that insight itself is one that I think touches on some psychological ground truth such that they can hold on to it. And so that's why, getting back very long about to your original question, that's why I think it's just as applicable to, say, food addiction or whatever and I don't want to, yes, there's a risk of saying it works for everything. I don't think it's going to work for everything. But a whole lot of mental disorders, yeah, I think there's probably exceptions like, schizophrenia and some other kind of, just for the disorders that are more of like the end of a continuum for things we all experience, like anxiety or depression or, addiction, self-control, whether you have a full-blown addiction or just, all of us have self-control issues, whether it's with the cookies or something, or just, you wish you didn't respond, to your spouse in a certain way, with it, even if it's not over the top, you just wish you were, more patient with your kid. Or we all have these patterns that, like, I wish I did a little better with that. I wish I kind of fall into this same thing, and I didn't tell myself I shouldn't do that, but then I do it again. So, whether it's that or depression or anxiety, I think with a lot of that and trauma, again, something you may not have full blown PTSD, but if you live long enough, something about trauma, we're all human beings. And I think those things, there is an incredible potential because they are the things that psychotherapy can work for. And I think when psychedelics work, they work like psychotherapy. People can tell you a story that, like, oh, I saw myself in a different way. I kind of learned these lessons, and now I started to change the way, on a more habitual basis, on a daily basis, the way my habits of thinking about myself and going about life. And then that has a feed forward aspect. It's not like the drug is still in your system if you're less
Mhm.
depressed 6 months from now. And that's one of the burning questions: how in the world is this having this long term, from 1, 2, or 3 sessions? How's it having this effect months later? Well, it's because it's like psychotherapy. It's like, yeah, you can quit the psychotherapy if you've learned those lessons. And now, things like, if you've learned, if you have borderline personality disorder, if you learn, like with like one treatment, dialectic behavior therapy, part of his learning, like, oh, I'm in this really emotional, like kind of hot state right now. Just learning times like, oh, I'll get off the phone with the loved one I'm having an argument with, or I'll, rather than escalating a conflict, I'm just going to go home and like let myself cool off. Like that can be invaluable. And once you're in the habit of just doing that, it's like self-reinforcing because you realize your life's just better. And so it's kind of like that. You just establish, it can help you establish better patterns, and
Yeah.
you learn something from it. When it works, it seems more like that.
Okay. So those are some of the more common reactions, and obviously positive. But what would you say? Because people have these life-changing experiences doing this treatment. What are some of the more uncommon or interesting realizations that people have had that have stood out to you and made you think and really intrigued you? What they're realizing about the universe and themselves.
Yeah, well, people have all kinds of amazing, like very interesting insights about the about
Really?
the universe. And now a lot of that is in, I mean, really the realm of that I can't speak to as a scientist. I mean, we don't know scientifically. We might all have our opinions, but we don't know ground truth. But people saying they've interacted with God and the source of the universe, and even people saying I could see sort of like the Big Bang, the origin of the universe. And now how much of this is a really interesting and active imagination, essentially, because they know about these things, they know about Big Bang, they know about, the stories of God and like what, and so I just want to be clear, it's impossible to say whether this is some sort of
Right.
scientific like window into ultimate reality, which I know scientists who have been fooled into really thinking that, it's not that we know that it isn't, oh, this is just brain effect. So it's neither that you confirm nor deny. We just scientifically can't speak to that. That's more of a
Sure.
philosophical, personal question. You can't just, oh, well, that's just some tinkering around in the brain, therefore it's not possible that like, well, philosophically it's possible you've altered the nervous system so that it's more sensitive to some fundamental aspect to the universe. But I also don't know that to be the case in these
Right.
particular instances. So, but yeah, people have said, I've seen people, overcome the death of, or I'd say have extremely cathartic, seemingly very helpful experiences in overcoming the death of a loved one. People reorienting towards their cancer, did a lot of research with cancer, depression, and anxiety. Um, People, all kinds of metaphors for the self, like seeing themselves as like this plant that's growing and that's thriving. That I think the mind goes places where it's to some degree like the world of dreams, where it's like it can find ways that are expressing itself that are more abstract, than in that can be really compelling than a normal waking consciousness. So there's all kinds of examples, and just like things that stick with people. Like I remember one participant saying, actually a few different participants, different analogies of how to deal with issues. Like one, like someone's like obsessive thoughts, they're the stuff that they can't seem to let go of, like with their cancer or other, like they could their image, like some image of a conveyor belt, and like they can put these issues in a cup and just kind of let it trail off and fall off the edge,
Hmm.
and like that being okay. But it
Wow.
sounds kind of weird and just this random image,
But it
but like,
makes sense to them. That's their analogy or metaphor for it.
right, like you could just like let go of that, and it's sort of like, there's the things you can affect and things you can't affect, and just saying like, look, I can't do anything about that. I'm not gonna let it destroy me. And you just like, bye, and just let it go. And like, again, I think something we can all have trouble with to some degree or another, but it's probably very helpful to have this like very memorable, salient experience where you have kind of more of an anchor on that because now you have a story. It's sort of like the power of like we're humans, like like narrative is probably more important than anything. It's why like much of religion is like the power of parable and these stories and the stuff of myth and like when you have something that you could kind of wrap your head around that you could say, oh yeah, it's like this cup that's kind of going off and can fall off the conveyor belt. Like that's something you can remember and sink your
Mm-hmm.
teeth into in a way that just sort of this highfalutin conceptual way of like, well, we can't control all of our problems, therefore we have to let go and yeah, just words. But like if you can actually, no, I remember that image, and what I felt
Yeah.
during that time.
So psychedelics can also um, they can have different effects for people. Explain this because I just saw this on your Twitter. Something like you were quoted in this article about Prince Harry, and you're saying something about how taking psychedelics it inspires someone to be estranged from their family. But you said you were kind of misquoted, or do you want to set the
Yeah,
record straight on that?
I answered this was some time ago. Gosh, it's over a year ago, I think. But like, I should have known better than to even comment. I tried my best to like say I know nothing about but theoretically, like you know could it put you in a state where you're more manipulable by a family member or other um in a way that could have harmful effects? Yeah, sure. I mean, the CIA used these drugs to brainwash people in the MK Ultra program, and so, yeah, but again, I know nothing, I don't know. I
Yeah, because
can't
was there
speak about
evidence that
whether Meghan Markle has done that to Prince
did
Harry.
he? Yeah, did he? Is there some sort of story there? Did he take
Well,
psychedelics or?
so yeah, and the thing that made me want to comment on it was that he apparently said that he's done ayahuasca, which is one of these. It's in the same category as psilocybin or LSD. It's a sacramental South American um, beverage that contains DMT, which is a classic psychedelic, very much like psilocybin. And he says that it helped him overcome the death of his mother,
Hmm.
Diana. And the reason I wanted to comment for it is like, because this was, it sounded like a skeptical story. Oh, is that crazy? And my answer was again with the caveat of like, look, I don't know anything personally about, but is it possible for a psychedelic experience on something like ayahuasca to be psychologically helpful in someone overcoming and coming to terms with the death of a loved one, like a mother? Like, absolutely. Like, that's a plausible story. So this isn't like some crazy thing that's never been said before. Like, I've seen this in my hands in my lab, even when that's not the thing you're nominally studying. But like again, I mentioned earlier, like the death of a loved one is something that seems to really can be affected by this. And so my only thing was like, hey, don't sort of just go tabloid and like dismiss that out of hand about some crazy drug fueled experience that he's been warped into thinking. Just again, I don't know his case individually, but just that's a plausible story from what we know about the drug. Um, and so, but then these other things like whether like Megan was brainwashing him or something.
Oh,
Which
yeah.
I'd,
Well, but
I'd,
that's
I'd
so
rather not be involved with any internal family drama, even if it's
right.
the real family. It's like
Yeah.
you
Well,
know.
with ayahuasca though, like I've heard, I follow this podcaster, and he seems like a pretty straight laced guy, but he swears by ayahuasca. But I mean, from what I can tell, isn't there like isn't that a riskier psychedelic to take? Like that could cause some serious psychosis. Would it be temporary, or I mean, you couldn't cause
Well,
permanent psychosis from taking ayahuasca, could you?
Fizzy. For the most part, it's in the same category of psilocybin and LSD. And so much of the effects, in terms of psychosis risk, that's going to be more about the dose and most importantly, whether someone has some vulnerability to those disorders. So there hasn't really been any case in thousands of patients that have been treated in the earlier or modern era of formal research where someone that passed screening that didn't look like they showed any signs of schizophrenia or related disorders, or even pre-morbid, like say early signs, maybe they don't have a diagnosis, but you can pick up on early signs, like sometimes they hear voices, this type of thing. It doesn't appear that someone without those indications can become schizophrenic. There are anecdotes where it very much looks credible that someone who has that predisposition or has um, active, psychosis, that it's worsened their psychosis, and I find that very credible. There are some areas, so in that sense, it depends on the person. It depends on the dose of the drug. For the most part, I'd put ayahuasca in the same category as psilocybin in mushrooms or LSD, with the exception of ayahuasca does have multiple things in it. One of which is, and it differs by, there's different plant concoctions that can make up so-called ayahuasca, but always contains something that contains DMT and other tryptamine-like psychedelics. That's the actual psychedelic. But then it contains another plant that contains, like, normally DMT is going to, when you swallow it, it's going to be chewed up in the gut and it's never going to get to your brain. And that's why a lot of times recreationally or outside of research, a lot of times people will smoke DMT because you can ingest it that way. But to swallow it, it will work if you combine it with another substance that inhibits the metabolic system that normally breaks down the DMT. So these are called MAO inhibitors. So with ayahuasca, it's typically stuff like harmaline and related compounds that are they break down the enzymes in the gut that normally degrade the DMT. One of the risks of that is that some medications out there are normally, like prescription medications are normally like that MAO system is what degrades their, that's how they're metabolized. And so if you knock down the MAO system, now you might have like fivefold the blood levels of some prescription drug that you're on. And sometimes that can be dangerous or even fatal. So that's why one has to be really careful with ayahuasca, like what other medications and drugs are you taking? Because there could be some potentially even lethal interactions. So that might be what, in terms of how strong the psychedelic experience can get, I think, to me, that really comes down to dose. I don't think it's fundamentally more intense than psilocybin. Some people have that opinion, but there's a lot of opinions. But, you'll find other people to say, "Oh, like that's baloney. Like they just haven't taken enough psilocybin." Like they're basing on the handful of times they've taken psilocybin and the handful of times they've taken ayahuasca, and they may have just taken more ayahuasca.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if people are interested in pursuing this kind of experience, whether they're dealing with addiction or depression or PTSD, where can they go pursue this? I mean, is it certain states that it's legal, or does it have to be through research or?
So the most accessible thing is going to be ketamine, which is legal. So you can go to a physician, and so either through like Spravato, which your insurance may even cover it. They may have require you to having tried your traditional antidepressants first, and if you still need treatment. So, but there's Spravato. Then there's other forms of ketamine, and a lot of which I told you some worst case scenarios before about sending people home with it. And there are plenty of ketamine providers that sound like they're doing really good, legitimate work that's safe. So I would just say, buyer beware, be cautious with that landscape. Make sure you're going to get the supervision. You want to do it in a clinic with licensed professionals that, I mean, I'd want to make sure that there's a good reputation.
Yeah.
You probably, if you've had a friend or gosh, better than nothing, just reviews online of people saying, "Oh yeah, that clinic really took care of me. They really seemed to
What
care."
about
Really,
with
um,
psilocybin? Is there a clinic for that?
so that you're going to need either in the United States legally, you're going to need to be in a clinical trial, which you can go to clinicaltrials.gov to. Now there's a lot of clinical trials going on, but chances are you're not going to, you know, don't hold your breath, but it's worth a look.
Okay.
Um, because it could be that you want to treat whatever, and that there's no study on that. Like,
Oh.
again, we can't just do like, it's not like you have to do a study like we're treating this specific disorder, and so
Mhm.
it's not like we could just try like one
So
off.
what are you working on right now? You said with smoking is the current thing.
Smoking, I have some work set up that hasn't started yet, but will soon, using LSD to treat chronic pain. So seeing if that can help people with lower back pain. Um, uh,
Interesting.
and my good colleague Scott Aronson here, and I'll be helping him going forward, has had longstanding work on depression. I've done depression work before, but work using psilocybin to treat major depressive disorder. Um,
And where are you look? Because you were at John Hopkins, but you're somewhere else now. I forget.
yeah, Sheppard Pratt. Yeah, yeah.
Which
And I have
is
a part-time
where?
appointment at Johns Hopkins, but Sheppard Pratt in Baltimore,
Baltimore.
Maryland. And so, yeah, we've got a number of studies going on here: depression, tobacco use disorder, and like I said, soon to be chronic pain would be the stuff that's going to be going on in the shorter term. But again, also clinicaltrials.gov is a good resource
Okay.
for trials in your area. There are retreats out there in Jamaica and
Okay.
Peru and even the Netherlands, either using psilocybin mushrooms or ayahuasca. I'm not recommending it, but the reality is that some people are interested in those things. I would just caution people to know that there are risks, and
Sure.
some of these retreat centers sounds like they're doing things responsibly and screening folks and got a physician on hand, and others sound like the Wild West.
Oh,
So,
okay.
buyer beware, and also know that a lot of people will think it's legal. There is something called the Travel Act, which technically makes it illegal to go to another country to do something that's illegal here.
Oh, I didn't know
Um,
that.
yeah, look it up. There's a good Wikipedia page. Now, yeah, I don't know of any instance where, like, for decades, even before, a lot of states here have legalized cannabis, or, I never know of a single case of them busting people going to Amsterdam and smoking pot. But, there's also cases of people, like if you're a professional, in mental health, and you see this as part of and you're even playing it up in your credentials, if you've gone through this retreat, or
Hmm.
there's different cases. Like I remember a CEO several years ago now kind of bragging about microdosing, and he was canned by his board of directors because it's like, you're just admitting to Schedule 1 substance use. So I do want to remind people, it's like
Yeah.
there is a legal landscape here, and
But it's
psych
also possible that,
are illegal. And
yeah, psilocybin and some of these other things may be legal in the future. Like there's a lot of people are banking on
yes,
that. Like you said, it's a money thing, which is also interesting because don't the drug companies make more of like antidepressants than they would like a one-time psilocybin thing?
yeah, so it's a
Keep
different
taking
model. Now, psilocybin is going to be more expensive acutely because there's a lot of professional time.
yeah.
So, it is sort of swimming upstream because it goes against the typical, treatment model. In this landscape, I should also mention there's the law in Oregon that's in practice, and also now in Colorado, which I don't think has been started or implemented yet, but of allowing kind of not for treating disorders technically, but um exploration, spiritual use, or just I forget how exactly.
Decriminalized, right? I think is what
What's that?
did they decriminalize it in Oregon? I think they
Well, it's
decriminalize
complex
everything.
because they also Oregon decriminalized drugs across the board, but they also set up a regulated program where they have licensed facilitators
Okay.
for psilocybin mushroom sessions.
Okay. I think they rolled some of that
So
stuff
that's a
back.
little more than decriminalization.
Okay. Gotcha.
Yeah, and they might have rolled back aspects of the actual drug decriminalization too.
Yeah. I think maybe like the fentanyl and heroin, maybe they decided, oh, maybe this isn't such a good idea. I don't know.
Right. I mean, there's a whole lot of unintended consequences is the rule rather than the exception with drug policy. So
Yeah.
whether it's more restrictive or opening things up, it's like you need a lot of wisdom, and there's devils in the details. But those things with those state programs, you're in a situation that medical cannabis is in much of the country, where it's like, yep, it's legal at the state level, but also do realize it's technically in violation of federal law. So for most people, that's not going to have a functional consequence, but for some people it would, and it also may be something that you don't want to be, vocal about, again, probably depending on who you are and what you do. But it's a complex landscape. So, I would just generally encourage people to be aware of all of the risks,
Yeah.
both, the physiological, the bad trip, you know,
And for legal purposes, I'm
and
telling
legal.
everyone to nobody to do any drugs at all. So
What's that?
I said for legal purposes, I'm telling everyone to not do
Right.
any drugs at all whatsoever. Don't even take an aspirin, nothing, just all natural, no drugs, water
Yes,
and food. That's what I tell
and I
people.
would say that like truly, not just it's a funny disclaimer, but truly ethically, even caffeine. Like there's some people out there that shouldn't. They need to
Yeah.
really watch their coffee, or they'd be best not
People
to drink coffee. I
people
mean,
have
there's some
died from
people with
energy
severe heart
drinks, right?
disease, but that's not good. Or they're suffering. It should be the first thing your doctor asks you if you go in for anxiety. It's like, tell me how much caffeine you're drinking.
Right.
And so
No.
even with that, so I always say I don't encourage any substance use. Like, you're responsible for your own health. I'm also not I'm not, wagging my finger as a moralist at people, but I'm not encouraging any substance use, legal or illegal, because there's a whole wide range of landscape of risks, both direct and potentially
Yeah.
legal, depending on the substance. And so,
But it could also
yeah,
save someone's life if someone's suicidal and they're like right on the verge of suicide. Maybe taking a psychedelic as opposed to killing yourself is worth the risk for that person. It could save lives. I mean, especially if we can make this
yeah,
legal in the supervised setting. I mean,
right.
I would advocate for that in the future. But right now, it's kind of it's unfortunately, it sounds like it's not really available to
Right.
Americans.
And that's a tough place to be. And the only thing we could do is like, continue the research to hope
Yeah.
if it's approved as safe and efficacious under the right conditions, make the options available. But like I remember all kinds of people. I remember one lady in particular, I don't know why, but years ago now, but after we concluded our cancer work, she said, "Oh, my husband's got terminal whatever form of cancer." It's like, "Can you get this?" And it's like, "No, we're not doing that trial. I have a colleague at so and so who's hoping to get a trial up and started in the next couple of years." She's like, "He's got a few months left. Is there anything?" And you just like, yeah, like, it's like there's nothing legal that I
Ugh.
can tell you about. It's just not happening. And it's absolutely heartbreaking.
Yeah.
So, and obviously, you know, you get in a difficult situation. Like if someone's suicidal, I'd want them to, like, yeah, don't,
Yeah.
never give up hope,
Right.
seek help. Um, there's also a risk in seeing psychedelics as your only option because
Hmm.
they don't work for everyone. I've seen people with
Yeah.
high hopes that have been crushed. They're like, my God, if this doesn't work, then nothing will. No, that's not the case. This may not be the thing for you, or maybe they've nudged you along the way. You don't know that maybe then the next thing might be more helpful. Some
Yeah.
boring old standard treatment. So it's like, never give up hope is the real.
Yeah.
Don't put your faith in bigger things than
Absolutely.
psychedelics. It's just one other. Hopefully, it's an important option we can have on the table in a more of a regular way, regulated, legal way for people if it passes the right standards. But it's a mistake to put that type of faith in anything. Like just
Yeah,
gonna
I agree.
hope. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, you're doing some great research. I hope to see you on like Joe Rogan next because you've done all Huberman and Lex Friedman. So I feel like Rogan's the next for you. And I'll
That'd be
follow your
fun.
career and look forward to seeing more research. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
All right. I'll talk to you later.
All right. Take care.
Bye
Thank you.
bye.